Well, you have to understand, in 1680, when the Hopi Revolution hit and they threw the Spaniards out, and that revolt threw the Spaniards out, there was a fear the Spaniards would return and they would retaliate. So the Hopis had to make a decision. Did they want to live in their villages and continue their culture and their farming with the possibility of being enslaved again under the Spaniards? Or do they leave their home? Do they leave their village? Do they leave farming? And do they go to their natural enemy, the Navajos, and live with freedom there? And the answer was many of them left, took their sheep, took the loom, went to the Navajos and asked if they could live with them. They would rather live in freedom with the Navajos than to be under the fear of being enslaved by the Spaniards. Great lesson for us to learn is how valuable that is in real life. And yet we take it so much for granted. But can you imagine asking you to give up your home, your livelihood and everything and go live someplace else just for the sake of your freedom? So freedom is a real lesson to learn here when you think of what the Hopis did. And because of that turn of events in the 1700s and 1800s, the Navajos now got sheep, they got the loom, they got the Spanish sheep, they got the knowledge how to make it from the Hopis, and they did one other thing. They took the loom and they turned it. And now they could make a blanket all in one piece. So what also was different was the culture of the Navajos. Don't forget, the men now are out hunting every day. They're bartering, they're trading. They don't have time to make blankets. So making blankets fell on to the women of the Navajos. And they were better blanket makers. They made it tight woven. They made blankets so that actually they were waterproof. What a valuable thing for people living out in the wilderness, even the Spaniards. And believe it or not, what was the one thing they had? They now had the ability to make better blankets, and blankets were in demand by the Cheyennes, the Apaches, Hopis, Pueblo Indians, and believe it or not, the Spaniards themselves. And so the Navajo blanket business boomed, and Navajos became very wealthy in terms of Indian tribes because they had a product that everybody wanted. They had the best blanket makers in the world, and they were highly sought after. What happens now is we enter what's called the classical period, which is what we've been talking about. But in this classical period, the Navajos designed what they called the chieftain blanket. Now the chieftain blanket is not a blanket for chiefs, as I thought when I first read. I thought, oh, if I buy a chieftain blanket, it must have been worn by a chief. You know, you assume things like that. No, what this was you had to be a master weaver. You had to know how to weave a blanket excellent. This blanket here is so tightly woven that when you pour water on it, it repels it. Not all blankets can do that. This blanket here will repel some of the water. Other blankets down the way will not repel water at all. So this blanket became what was known as the chieftain blanket. Now the first chieftain blankets looked like this. They had these lines, but all straight lines. With the bottom lines usually were larger than the top ones. There was a specific amount of lines for each blanket. It was very structured how they made their blankets. They didn't vary from it. When you bought a chieftain blanket first phase, this is what it looked like. Same amount of lines, very structured, well woven, well done. Now that's called the first phase. I wanted to buy, and I don't have a first phase, you could see that. I told my wife I wanted to buy a first phase Indian Chief's blanket. Well, you have to understand one thing that happened in around 1804. In 1804, the Navajos, even though they were doing a lot of trading blankets, they still had this need to borrow things, because you have to understand they were trying to make a living out there, and part of their living and part of their culture was to borrow. But it's unfortunate they call it permanent borrowing, but some ways they returned it, but they bartered for it. Well, they did that with the Spaniards. They came across a group of Spaniards. They killed them. They took their implements. They thought, boy, we can really trade these things. The problem with that was the Spaniards reacted, and they started to go after the Navajos, and they started to track them. Navajos, being wise, knew that they had the elderly, the children with them. They didn't want to jeopardize their lives, and so when they came to a fork in the road, they went up this canyon, and they placed their elderly and their children in a cave, came back out the canyon, tried to erase the trail so that the Spaniards would follow them. But when the Spaniards got there, they didn't do a very good job. The Spaniards turned, went up the canyon, and found the cave. When you do a violent act, there are consequences. In this case for the Navajos, the consequence was everyone in that cave was killed. It was called today Massacre Cave. What happened when the Navajos returned? They buried all their dead in the blankets that they were wearing. Because of Massacre Cave, we have a fairly good idea of what the blankets looked like in the 1700s. But that tragedy was the knowledge that the Navajos gained that with every violent act, there's a response. And when you look at that in our lives today, when you take a look, it still applies. Like my dad said, history repeats itself. 9/11, violent act. Our response came this year. People have to understand there are consequences when you get angry, when you commit violent acts, and there's liability, and it really ends up sometimes a tragedy. When I asked my wife, and don't think it doesn't apply to marriage, it does. When I asked my wife, I said, I'd like to buy, you see, I have a second phase. I want to get a first phase Indian chief's blanket. I said, I want to buy one. And she said, Gary, you could buy anything you want, but before I say yes to some, I'd like to know how much it is. I said, well, one in the rough needed a lot of work, which is what I'd be looking for. It's about $600,000. If I find one really nice, it's a little over $1 million. And her next words were, over my dead body. So you see, a violent act of buying a blanket can lead to and I decided for health conditions, I don't have a first phase Indian chief's blanket. But I do have a second phase. Second phase came in about 1800s to about 1870. This is about an 1870s second phase Indian chief's blanket. You can see the patterns here. We have 4, 8, 12 of these lines. This is the first time we see this, the second phase, and it takes a master. When you fold this blanket and you wear it, this rectangle here lines up with this one perfectly. You had to be a master weaver to do that. And in order to make it so tight that it was water repellent, you had to be a master weaver. So to create a blanket like this took a long time, but it was highly sought after. The Indians became a little more creative. Remember the influence way back here of the Spanish came into the third phase by 1860. This is another, I have a red one that's very beautiful, but I chose this one because it's a lot easier to see. Take a look at the serrated diamond in the center. You can understand the influence where it came from. So Spanish influence still occurred in the blanket. But what's beautiful about this, if you take this edge and you line up with this edge, you create this diamond. That's how masterful these blankets were. Then came, of course, the variant blanket. Now, the reason I put the variant blanket up is because we're looking now, this is an 1880s blanket, is because now you see these beautiful lines in the color that they were supposed to be intended for. It's a chieftain blanket. When you see these lines, it's a chieftain blanket. But for the first time, Indians are breaking the code. You see how this is a set design? A set design, this is not.